dangerous. Michael Jackson in Bucharest. Michael Jackson's Dangerous Tour reaches Bucharest, Friday at 11 on 1.
On 2 shortly, Jeremy Paxman and his guests, Dr. Sheila Cassidy, Austin Mitchell MP, and cookery expert Caroline Waldegrave discuss some recent television, including the Cecil Parkinson story and Floyd on Spain. Did you see?
Do you lose him? Oh, they fell in my nick. Meanwhile, the politicians are treating us like wallies and not one decent suspect.
Martin Shaw leads the hunt for a killer.
Pull out all the stops. We need a policeman who can totally immerse himself in their subculture.
You've been seconded for special duty. So you best go home and see your mum.
Undercover, under threat. Black and Blue, Screen 1 in 15 minutes.
And now, at 9:10, the news on BBC1 with Michael Burke.
Bryan Gould has resigned from the shadow cabinet. He said it had been a gag and a straitjacket on his views about Europe. And the Zulu leader, Chief Buthelezi, has pulled out of the South African peace process. Good evening. Bryan Gould, the opposition National Heritage spokesman, has resigned from the shadow cabinet at the start of the Labour Party conference in Blackpool. Mr. Gould has been an outspoken opponent of the Maastrict Treaty on closer European Union. The shadow cabinet, he said, had operated as a gag and a straitjacket on his strongly held views about the economy and Europe.
Bryan Gould delivered a letter of resignation addressed to John Smith 1 hour before making his latest and most outspoken attack on party policy. At a meeting of Labour Eurosceptics, Mr. Gould seemed determined to ignore John Smith's call for Labour unity, thus making his exit from the shadow cabinet unavoidable. A single currency, he said, was futile, the Maastricht Treaty was anti-democratic, and Britain deserved a referendum. His rejection of official policy was complete.
I have to acknowledge, however, that the views I express cannot any longer be expressed by a member of the shadow cabinet. I have no illusions as to how rapidly I will be disowned and marginalized by a decision to speak my mind. But I have decided, so long as my voice is heard, to use it to argue those great issues of full employment, democracy, the capacity to govern ourselves, our future in Europe. It is with the greatest regret that I acknowledge that I will have to do so from outside the shadow cabinet. Thank you very much.
But the other Eurosceptics in the shadow cabinet, when they heard the news, seemed to distance themselves somewhat from Mr. Gould's decision.
A very sad decision. I don't think he should have resigned, unless he particularly wants to advocate the case for referendum, and that's been rejected by the shadow cabinet, the national executive, and presumably conference. If he wants to argue for that, I'm not a supporter of referendum, and perhaps that justifies his position.
John Smith is said to be privately relieved that Mr. Gould has taken the plunge, but he's also annoyed that the start of his first conference as leader has been overshadowed by Mr. Gould's departure.
No, I respect his decision. We reached in the shadow cabinet a clear view on our policy. He finds that he cannot accept that. He has resigned. The rules of collective responsibility are thereby reaffirmed, which is why I respect the decision which he has arrived at.
But some of Mr. Smith's allies were more openly critical.
That's for Bryan Gould to ask himself, question his own conscience of why he's got the conference off to what, in my view, is a total distraction. He represents on Europe a minority view, maybe a vocal minority, but a minority view.
For Mr. Gould, being out of the shadow cabinet does not mean being out of the limelight. His campaign against Maastricht will be stepped up, and Labour's efforts to minimise its divisions on Europe are badly undermined.
Mr. Gould campaigned strongly on European issues in the run-up to the leadership election in July, in which he was heavily defeated by John Smith. Since then, Mr. Gould has been openly expressing his long-standing doubts about the direction being taken by the European community. Our political correspondent Steve Richards reports.
The smiles from the two leadership contenders this summer disguised a relationship which had been tense for several years, a tension which Mr. Gould reflected earlier in the campaign itself.
They can see that it's been a contest in which fixing has been substituted for voting. They wanted a debate, and instead they've been presented with an attempted stitch-up.
But it was after the glitzy 1987 election campaign, in which Mr. Gould played a starring role, that differences between him and Mr. Smith emerged. In the shadow cabinet there were disagreements over economic policy and Labour's alternative to the poll tax, and more recently the Maastricht Treaty. As a Labour candidate in the 1970s, he was similarly against Britain's entry into the common market, views firmly held as his campaign organiser at the time recalls.
In the period I worked with him from 1972 to 1979, he held very strong views about Europe, and indeed at the time of the referendum took the opposing view that Britain should not enter. So I'm not at all surprised in the light of recent happenings that Bryan has taken this principled stand.
But at last week's National Executive Committee, he knew his public opposition to the leadership would be tolerated no longer.
Well, we will know today what it is that Mr. Smith wants. I've always said that if someone will tell me where the line is, I can then decide whether to toe it or not.
Mr. Gould is regarded as one of the Labour Party's thinkers. He's written one book on socialism, would like to be in the Treasury team, but knows this is unlikely to happen under John Smith. After the election, he wanted more time to reflect on policy. His decision today means he'll also have the freedom to express those views when they conflict with the leadership.
And Bryan Gould joins me now from Blackpool. Mr. Gould, some of your colleagues are saying tonight that the timing of your resignation at the start of a Labour conference, which will be taking advantage or trying to take advantage of Conservative splits over Europe, that the timing couldn't be worse, that it's a gift for the Tories.
Well, of course, the timing is never right for these sorts of steps because they're very regrettable, and I certainly regret having to take it. But I was put in a position, I think, on Wednesday when I had asked simply that the door should not be closed on a referendum. I was put in a position where that door was indeed closed. I could have resigned, and indeed perhaps should have resigned immediately, but it was very much in my mind that to resign then would have been to cut across the very important debate the following day when John Smith scored a very signal triumph. If I delayed too long, however, I would inevitably be drawn into and therefore compromised by that system of collective responsibility which has meant that so many of Britain's political leaders have stayed silent on these vital issues when, in my view, they should have spoken up.
Only a week ago you said you'd only have to resign, if you were forced into a corner. Do you feel you have been forced into a corner?
Yes, I'm not sure whether that's happened by accident or design. But as I say, on Wednesday of this week, this last Wednesday, I had argued solely that we should keep the door open to a referendum, that we need not decide that issue at this point. The NEC and the Shadow Cabinet decided by substantial majorities to oppose a referendum, and it became clear, therefore, that the Labour Party was unlikely to provide an obstacle to what I regard, in the Maastricht Treaty, as a blueprint for permanently entrenched deflation. And since I do believe that this is of vital importance to the people I hope the Labour Party represents, and since I believe it means very bad news for their jobs and life chances and businesses and houses and so on, I felt that there was very little option then but to take my stand.
Briefly, Mr. Gould, and it has to be very briefly, I'm afraid, do you think others will follow you?
No, I don't think so, and I hope not. I've certainly advised my friends in the Shadow Cabinet and elsewhere that they should not feel any obligation to follow me. I hope they will get on with doing their jobs as well as they possibly can.
Mr. Gould, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
A majority of both Labour and Conservative backbench MPs questioned in an NOP survey oppose the Maastricht Treaty in its present form. The poll, carried out for the BBC's On the Record programme, indicates that of the 112 Tory backbenchers interviewed, 66 said they preferred the government to abandon the bill, or at least make changes to it. Of 100 Labour backbenchers interviewed, 66 said they'd either vote against or press for changes.
There's increasing hostility to the Maastricht Treaty among Tory MPs since the Sterling crisis. But the Sunday newspapers illustrate the scale of John Major's task in reasserting his authority, angering the Chancellor, Norman Lamont, by naming him as the Euro dissidents' chief sympathiser in the Cabinet. In a series of interviews, ministers put their own emphasis on the government line. Michael Howard, who's a prominent Euro doubter in the Cabinet, said pulling out of the exchange rate mechanism was a setback, but one which had freed Britain from the influence of the Bundesbank.
To that extent, although it was a setback, it is also an opportunity, and one which I'm absolutely determined that the government will take full advantage of, and which I'm sure it will.
And the minister, who yesterday described the Tory opponents of Maastricht as Europhobes, dismissed the notion of rejecting the Maastricht Bill.
The British Parliament has endorsed this treaty. The British Prime Minister has endorsed this treaty. And I think it would be a humiliation and a setback for Britain, which is not something that either my party or I think any party in the House would wish to see.
John Major hopes to finish the task he began at Maastricht last December, and he's meeting his Danish and French counterparts this week, knowing the divisions in the Tory party can only make his task of getting the treaty back on track more difficult. But the government's confident it can get the Maastricht Bill through the Commons once the Danes move to reverse their vote against the treaty, if only with the help of Labour's official abstention and internal divisions.
The BBC's political editor, John Cole, is at the Labour Party conference in Blackpool. John, how much of a blow is Bryan Gould's resignation, and the timing of it, perhaps, for the Labour Party?
Well, I think he explained the timing rather well in his interview with you just now, Michael. The fact is that this kind of thing at any time is awkward. I think what's worrying for the Labour leadership is that a politician of Mr. Gould's prominence and age, he's a comparatively young man, he's not going out of politics, and whether he wants it or not, he will inevitably put himself at the head of that group in the Labour Party who are very sceptical about recent developments in Europe, and that clearly leaves a split down not the middle of the Labour Party but well into the flesh of the Labour Party.
How will this be viewed by the government side? They've got their own problems over Europe after all.
Well, clearly the Conservatives will take some comfort from it. I saw one pro-European backbencher this evening said that he was unsurprised by the resignation and unsurprised by the fact that the people who felt the same way in the Conservative cabinet were not resigning. Now, we have seen on the previous report just now how deep those divisions are. Frankly, both parties, but particularly the government party, depend on events, how things develop. Undoubtedly will get the Maastricht Bill back in the Commons sometime either at the end of this year or the beginning of next, but the real problem is the exchange rate mechanism. The British government is afraid of being left behind, and that is why the fact that people like Michael Howard and perhaps the Chancellor are dragging their feet in that area is very worrying for Mr. Major and those who think like them.
John Cole, thank you. Other news now, the Zulu leader Chief Buthelezi says he'll have nothing more to do with the South African government's bid to negotiate a new multiracial constitution. He feels he was bypassed when President de Klerk and the ANC leader Nelson Mandela met yesterday without him. They agreed to ban the carrying of dangerous weapons and to fence off township hostels that have been trouble spots. Moves, he says, are aimed against his Inkatha Party supporters.
On the march in their homeland, Zulus who support the Inkatha Freedom Party have served notice that they will take on all comers, the government, the ANC, anyone who dares to challenge them. A display of defiance before their king and his chief minister, Mangosuthu Buthelezi. The IFP are incensed by the outcome of yesterday's summit between the government and the ANC. Chief Buthelezi, who commands the loyalty of Zulu traditionalists, revealed that Inkatha was severing relations with the government, a political alliance broken. The Zulu, he warned, would defy the government's ban on carrying weapons.
The nationwide blanket ban will never be enforceable. Any attempt to force such a ban on the Zulu nation will heighten tensions and escalate violence.
On Zulu hostels, which are now to be secured by barbed wire fencing, there was this second warning.
The inmates of hostels will tear down any fences put around them and do so with their bare hands if needs be.
In Johannesburg yesterday, the talk was of reconciliation. Here today, the talk is of a government sellout to the ANC. Inkatha and their Zulu supporters have served notice that they will fight rather than surrender what they say is theirs by right.
Whilst inside the stadium, the Zulus celebrated the anniversary of their founder, King Shaka. Outside, demonstrators heading towards the homes of known ANC supporters were confronted by the police. Tear gas was used. Shots were fired, and once again, nightfall in the townships brought with it uncertainty about the days ahead. John Harrison, BBC News, KwaZulu.
163 people are reported dead after a Nigerian Air Force plane crashed last night. The Hercules transport was en route from Lagos to the town of Kaduna in the northeast of the country when it came down shortly after takeoff. A Roman Catholic teenager has been murdered in North Belfast. He was shot several times at close range by a number of gunmen in his home in the New Lodge Road area. His mother tried to stop the gunmen. They escaped in a car which was later found abandoned in a predominantly loyalist district. The shooting happened despite heavy security patrols in the area at the time. Football, and Paul Gascoigne's league debut for the Italian club Lazio ended at half-time today after he injured his right knee. It was Gascoigne's first competitive match since he ruptured ligaments in the same knee 16 months ago.
Surrounded inevitably by a swarm of photographers, Paul Gascoigne's assertion that he was ready to play in the Italian league was about to be tested to the full. His league debut for Lazio had attracted a larger-than-average attendance, most of whom were delighted by Gascoigne's early touches. Much of the old confidence seemed to have returned as he produced the most memorable moments of an undistinguished first half against Genoa. But Gascoigne's reputation will make him a marked man in Italy, and a foul by Mario Bortolazzi brought his debut to an abrupt end. Fears that he'd suffered a recurrence of the ligament damage to his right knee seemed to have been premature, though Gascoigne didn't reappear for the second half. This evening, Lazio's club doctor said he wouldn't know the full extent of the injury until tomorrow, but he doesn't think it's serious.
That's all from the newsroom. Good night.
Tomorrow morning's breakfast news will be coming live from Blackpool on the first day of the Labour Party conference. And of course there'll also be reports on all the other important stories from around the world. Breakfast news on BBC1 beginning at 6:30 tomorrow.
Good evening. By the time breakfast news is on our screen tomorrow morning, probably going to see a fair bit of mist and fog around across most parts of the country. There are already some dense patches forming right now. There's some rain about too. It's patchy and it's all moving northwards, a little pushing up into Northern Ireland and a few scattered outbreaks over northern England, now pushing mainly up through the eastern parts of Scotland. And it's this northward movement that's going to continue right through the night, so just a little bit of rain moving up towards the north. Perhaps one or two spots further out across England and Wales in the west there, but basically dry weather for most areas by the end of the night, but that mist and that fog. There will be some dense patches around by the end of the night, in fact, within the next few hours probably. And it's going to be a mild and very muggy night, and that's absolutely everywhere across the country. As far as tomorrow's concerned, we will have this weather front hanging around near the western side of Britain and a low pressure area lurking just across in the continent, closest of all to the southeast. Up this northeast coast of England and eastern Scotland, it's going to stay gloomy and rather cloudy all day. Rather cloudy but mostly dry out to the west. The cloud and mist thinning and disappearing in elsewhere. So there's some spells of fairly warm sunshine once more, but cool where it's foggy. That's it from me.
Frank, I'm going crazy, Frank. I had to go up to someone.
Sometimes it's hard to find you, Frank.
Everybody wants a piece of me! I need some space, okay?
If I go in that house next door, I'd kill someone.
You gotta talk to him. Please.
Civvies, Tuesday 9:30 on BBC1. He has a history.
Do you know who he is? Yes, William Hickok. Ma, Wild Bill Hickok was shot before I was born. We got J.B. Books here.
A legend with 3 loose ends in the Last Chance Saloon. John Wayne is the shootist. Tuesday, 11:30 on 1.
Now, our Screen One drama by this year's winner of the BAFTA Writers' Award, G.F. Newman. Martin Shaw, Ian Glenn and Don Henderson are among the cast in this fictional account of racial tension, police corruption and violence, graphically portrayed in black and blue.
Ah!